Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carolyn Best, Director of Programming and Arts and Letters Live here at the DMA, and welcome to our special event featuring Elliot Ackerman with Ben Fountain. And I want to offer special thanks to Ben and Elliot for being so flexible to reschedule due to the snow and ice. I want to thank the Arts and Letters Live staff and our volunteers, as well as the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth for their promotional partnership on this event. Arts and Letters Live is supported by the K. Catarula Endowment for the Literary and Performing Arts and our annual season supporters. Promotional supports provided by Texas Monthly and in-kind support by Einstein Printing. Just a few logistical details to mention. DMA friends in the audience, you can text the code ALL to the DMA's phone number to gain credits for attending tonight, and that's all part of our free membership program. After Elliot's presentation and reading and his conversation on stage with Ben, he's happy to answer any of your questions, so feel free to raise your hand and a staff member will bring a wireless microphone to you. And if you would, please stand up while asking your question just so that everyone can see and hear you clearly. Then we invite you to meet Elliot and Ben at the book signing near the museum store where copies of Green on Blue and Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk are available for purchase. Take a peek at the upcoming events noted in your program, and I hope that you'll join us for many more over the next few months. And I want to mention two that are coming up soon that I think you'll find particularly interesting. This coming Wednesday, March 3rd, we'll host Peter Mendelsohn, an amazing graphic artist who's designed many eye-catching book covers, including The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, who will share insights into his creative design process. His book, What We See When We Read, is a fascinating blend of images and text, and he calls it a phenomenology. And it makes all of us as passionate readers slow down and truly think about what an active collaboration reading is. It's not a passive activity, and it's about what we take for granted when we're absorbed in a book. On March 10th, don't miss Gail Sheehy, a seasoned journalist and author of 17 books. She'll be with us to discuss her best-selling memoir, Daring, My Passages. As a contributing editor to Vanity Fair since 1984, Sheehy has written in-depth character profiles of many leaders, including Mikhail Gorbachev, Margaret Thatcher, and Hillary Clinton. Sheehy blazed a trail into the male-dominated world of journalism and has become an icon for both women and men, striving to attain success in their careers and personal lives. Now I'd like to introduce Ben Fountain, who's done the honors of introducing and moderating conversations with several authors on our stage over the years, including Malcolm Gladwell last year. Ben is the author of the short story collection Brief Encounters with Che Guevara, which received the PEN/Hemingway Award, the Barnes & Noble Discover Award for Fiction, and a Whiting Writers Award. His novel, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, received the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the Flaherty Dunnan First Novel Prize. And it's being adapted for film by three-time Oscar-winning director Ang Lee and Sony's TriStar Studios. He's lived in Dallas since 1983 and currently holds the University Endowed Chair in Creative Writing at Texas State University. Please give a warm welcome to Ben Fountain.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming out on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I'm very happy to be here today to introduce my good friend Elliot Ackerman to you. Elliot was born in Los Angeles, grew up in London and Washington, D.C., went to college in Boston, was based in various hellholes in Virginia and North Carolina during his career with the Marines, served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, and has lived for the past several years in Istanbul. But today, I'm going to lay claim to him as a Dallas writer. Elliot's great-grandfather was one of this region's first wildcatters, part of that hell-for-leather, roll-the-dice generation whose booms and busts are the stuff of legend. Elliot's grandfather, John Leadham, represented Dallas in the Texas State Senate for many years, and Elliot's mother, Joanne Leadham Ackerman, grew up about a driver in a 3-wood north of here in Highland Park. Elliot himself made many visits to Dallas while he was growing up, and he has family who still live in the Dallas area. So today, for all intents and purposes, we're welcoming home one of our own. Elliot joined the Marines ROTC while he was a student at Tufts University and was commissioned as a lieutenant immediately on his graduation in 2003. For the next 8 years, he served his country with rare distinction. Among his many significant missions, Elliot was in command of the combat platoon that led U.S. forces through Fallujah in the second battle for that city in the fall of 2004. Later, he led a special operations unit of 700 Afghans tasked with securing a hotly contested area of the Afghan-Pakistan border. For his service, Elliot was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. After leaving military service with the rank of captain in 2011, Elliot spent a year as a White House Fellow, where he specialized in veterans issues, and since then he's devoted himself full-time to writing. From his home base in Istanbul, where he lives with his wife and 2 children, Elliot has been turning out some of the most insightful reportage I've seen on the ongoing civil war in Syria and the rise of the Islamic State. His reportage and essays can be found in magazines such as The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, and The Daily Beast, and most recently in the current issue of Vogue magazine, where he writes movingly about his decision to finally leave the military. But it's in fiction that I think Elliot is going to make his truest mark, and his debut novel Green on Blue, which was published last month by Scribner, represents the opening blast of what I expect is going to be a long, strong career in American letters. Green on Blue has received critical acclaim across the board. Writing for the Daily New York Times, the famously prickly Michiko Kakutani says that Ackerman has done a remarkable job of imagining war from the perspective of an ordinary Afghan boy whose quiet village life unravels after his father, a farmer, and his mother are killed by militants. Kakutani goes on to say, "The novel as a whole attests to Mr. Ackerman's breadth of understanding, an understanding not just of the seasonal rhythms of war in Afghanistan and the harsh, unforgiving beauty of that land, not just of the hardships of being a soldier there, but a bone-deep understanding of the toll that a seemingly endless war has taken on ordinary Afghans who have known no other reality for decades." The New York Times got it right. Green on Blue is an extraordinary novel, and all the more so for being the work of an American author writing from an Afghan's perspective. As the very fine writer and critic Tom Bissell says in today's New York Times book review, Elliot Ackerman has done something brave as a writer and even braver as a soldier. He has touched, for real, the culture and the soul of his enemy. Vogue magazine describes Elliot as preppily handsome. I would describe him as a damn fine writer and a good friend, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming him to Dallas today.
Well, thanks so much to the Dallas Museum of Art, and thanks so much to all of you for coming out on a very blustery Sunday. I'm just going to read a little bit and start at the beginning. Many would call me a dishonest man, but I've always kept faith with myself. There is an honesty in that, I think. I am Ali's brother. We are from a village that no longer exists, and our family was not large or prosperous. The war that came after the Russians, but before the Americans killed our parents. Of them, I have only dim memories. There is my father's Kalashnikov hidden in a woodpile by the door, him cleaning it, working oiled rags on its parts, and the smell of gunmetal, and feeling safe. There is my mother's secret, the one she shared with me. Once a month, she'd count out my father's earnings from the fighting in the mountains or farming. She'd send me and Ali from our village, Sperkai, to the large bazaar in Orgun, a 2-day walk. The Orgun bazaar sold everything, 5 cooking oils and spices, candles to light our home, and fabrics to repair our clothes. My mother always entrusted me with a special purchase. Before we left, she would press an extra coin in my hand, one she'd stolen from my father. Among the crowded stalls at the bazaar, I would slip away from my brother's watchful eye and buy her a pack of cigarettes. a vice forbidden to a woman. When we returned home, I would place the pack in her hiding spot, the birchwood cradle where she'd rocked Ali and me as infants. Our mud-walled house was small, 2 thatch-roofed rooms with a courtyard between them. The cradle was crept in the room I shared with Ali. My mother would never get rid of the cradle. It was the one thing that was truly hers. At night, after we returned from the bazaar, she'd sneak into our room, her small, sandaled feet gliding across the carpets that lined the dirt floor. Her hand would cup a candle, its smothered light casting shadows on her young face, aging her. Her eyes, one brown and the other green, a miracle or defect of birth, shifted about the room. Carefully, she would lean over the cradle as she'd done before taking us to nurse. She would run her fingers between the blankets that once swaddled my brother and me, and, finding the pack I'd left her, she'd step into the courtyard, and I'd fall back asleep to the faint smell of her tobacco just past my door. This secret made me feel close to my mother. In the years since, I've wondered why she entrusted me with it. At times, I've thought it was because I was her favorite. But this isn't why. The truth is, she recognized in me her own ability to deceive. So that's the opening of the novel and the voice of the book's protagonist, Aziz, a young Afghan soldier. In writing this book and obviously thinking about it after publication, I often wondered, where did this novel begin? As Ben hinted in his introduction, I spent a lot of time serving as an advisor to Afghan soldiers in special operations and later on as an intelligence officer. So when I went to war in Afghanistan, in many respects, my war buddies were not Americans. They were these other Afghan soldiers. And we fought together, we bled together, we mourned friends together, but when we came back, when I came back, I knew I would never see any of them again, trapped as they were in that war's elliptical conflict. So these weren't guys I could keep up with on Facebook, go get quarter beers at the local VFW, or call long distance. And writing this book was really an effort to render their world as a last act of friendship, to try to tell the story of the war as they knew it. And I often go back when I was thinking about the beginning of this book, was I was trying to show through story a paradigm that existed. And I keep going back to this one anecdote, which is one of the Afghans I advised was a fellow named Ishaq. And Ishaq was a Tajik warlord who lived in Paktika province, which is right on the southeastern border of Afghanistan with Pakistan, right where southern Waziristan is, if you know anything about that, a really bad neighborhood. And so about every 2 weeks, Ishaq and I would meet up for what was very grandly called our operational planning meeting. But what that really involved was me going out to Ishaq's hooch, which was a plywood hut in the middle of our fire base, high up in the mountains, and we would sit down, and in that hooch was a lumpy old sofa. So reclining on this lumpy old sofa, right in front of us was a little coffee table. Sitting on the table was a pack of cigarettes, a bottle of chai, and in front of us was a large map and a large calendar. And so our operational planning meeting would go something like this. Ishaq would stroke his face, and he would look at the map, and I'd say, "So, Ishaq, where do you think we should go on patrol the next couple of weeks?" And looking at the map, he would point to one of the villages on the border. He'd say, "Mr. Elliot, we could go to Mangrate. There's always very good hunting in Mangrate." And so I'd say, "All right, Ishaq, that sounds good." We would get in our trucks, maybe 12 trucks, 100-plus soldiers. We would drive up to Mangrate, 50-50 over and under that we would get in a gunfight while we were up there. And then we would come back down. We would fix up our trucks, let the guys rest for a couple days. And inevitably, I would be sitting there back on Ishaq's sofa, pack of cigarettes, pot of chai, map, calendar. I'd say, "All right, Ishaq, that was a great mission up in Mangrate. What do you think we should do the next couple weeks?" And Ishaq would step back up to the map and he would stroke his face and look maybe at the village that was just to the south and say, "Mr. Elliot, we could go down to Rawakare. It's always very good hunting down in Rawakare." And we would do the exact same thing. Get in our trucks and go up to Rawakare. So That conversation was never one where Isak would look at the map and say, Mr. Elliot, if we go to Mangrate, then we hit them down in Rawakure, we can do one big push in Malikshay, knocking them across the border, then the war will be over, I can go back to my crops, and you can go home and go to business school or, get an MFA and start writing your novel. It just wasn't that type of war. So what type of war was it? And that's what I aim to show in this book through story. So the novel opens and you meet Aziz, this young Afghan, and in the first few pages, his parents are killed in the time between the Soviet occupation and the U.S. invasion. So he and his brother then go to Orgun, a nearby city where they eke out a living as delivery boys in the marketplace there. Then, regrettably, his brother is killed in a bombing. And while his brother is in the hospital, Aziz doesn't know how he's going to take care of him. So he gets recruited into the Special Lashkar, which is basically a militia unit. And the deal is that Aziz's salary will take care of his brother's treatment in the hospital as long as he stays a soldier. And thus, Aziz gets pulled into an increasingly elliptical war where nothing is as it seems, sides are very, very fluid. And as he gets involved in this war, the man he's working for, a guy named Commander Sabir, wants to build an outpost in a particular village. And that sort of becomes their raison d'etre, is to build this outpost. And in the service of that, Aziz is sent into that village to act as an informant. So I'd like to read from a little bit later in the book, when Aziz is staying with a man named Mumtaz in that village. And Mumtaz is an old Mujahideen fighter against the Soviets. And this is Mumtaz's story about his brother and the death of his brother. When my brother died, he said, it was not in the war we thought we fought. We were Mujahideen and treated as heroes in this village, our battlefield achievements known by all, earning us honor we became greedy for. This led to larger and more daring attacks. When the fighting slowed each winter, we'd grow impatient for it. The Russians stayed on their bases, and it was difficult to strike at them. An informant of ours in Orgun, a man who, like our father, ran a trucking company, told us how in a few nights a Russian convoy would pass our village along the North Road. Eager as we were, my brother and I asked few questions. The operation would be simple. After curfew, we'd bury a mine in the road, and in the morning, if the Russians didn't show up, we'd remove it. Some days later, in the darkness, my brother and I chipped a ditch out of the frozen earth and slid the mine in. We carefully repacked the crumbled soil and went home, giving the matter little thought, as if we'd planted a tree and casually wondered if it'd grow. We slept soundly, and early the following morning, before the sun rose, we returned to either inspect our kill or to recover the mine. As we walked through the clear, cold air, the snow on the distant hilltops glowed with firelight. The mine had struck, and we approached the road riding on great gusts of enthusiasm. But still our situation was uncertain. Who knew if the Russians had sent anyone to aid their convoy? Who knew if we'd come across any manic survivors? These were uncertainties we felt prepared for. We weren't prepared for what we found. As we crested a last ridge and glimpsed our kill, we saw only the beginning of our terrible mistake. Tilted against its side as if the carcass of a great steel beast was the truck, but it wasn't Russian. It was civilian and full of lumber that now burned in a pyre, sparkling on the snow. We kept our distance, but were close enough to feel the fire on our faces. We could see the cab in its white paint, which curled to scales against the heat, and then the steel beneath the paint that scorched to rust. Behind a shattered windshield, flames licked out an upright silhouette that burned with the dignity of one who met death immediately, without pain and shock, and through this absence seemed strangely alive. I can't say how long we watched the pyre. When we left, the sun still hadn't risen, but the silhouette had been consumed. On our journey home, we said nothing and tried to hide in our silence. News of the attack spread through all the families of Gomal. The truck had been from our informant's company, and the dead driver had been his employee. Several days later, my father and our village's Spengaris were called to a jirga in Orgun to settle the matter. The deliberations were short, lasting but 2 days, and my father returned in ruin. The Spengaris on both sides decreed that our father was responsible for our actions and that he must replace the destroyed truck and buy yet another to recoup the damaged cargo. In this, our informant made out very well, for the first truck forced us to sell our home, and the second wiped out my father's accounts, eliminating him as a business competitor. And that's when we moved here. So, the title of the novel, Green on Blue, if it's a term you're not familiar with, it refers to the ubiquitous insider tax that we often see on the news, where an Afghan soldier will turn his weapon on his American advisor and kill him. Green refers to friendly forces, and blue is military shortspeak for our own. But it also, the idea of a green on blue, becomes a bit of a metaphor. You know, what happens when the cause that you fight for threatens to destroy you? You know, and the book in and of itself, you know, really deals, I think, with a lot of these themes of moral relativism, particularly as it pertains to waging a war. And that was something, although the book's not autobiographical by any means, that I saw frequently in my experience. You know, to regale you with one anecdote in particular, later on in my career, I served as an intelligence officer. So one of my jobs was, in addition to advising Afghan troops, I often met with lots of Afghan sources who had information that, you know, may or may not have been of value to us. And at one point, there was a village, very, very remote village that was to the south of us, that we had no information coming out of this village. And so when we went down there, though, we knew it was a very large, what they call a rat line, a supply route for Taliban fighters going in from southern Pakistan down to southern Afghanistan in Helmand province, when in those years, 2010, 2011, U.S. Marines were fighting and dying in pretty significant numbers. And if you remember from the introduction, I used to be a U.S. Marine. So this was something that, you know, obviously was very personal to me. But the border was pretty much completely unguarded down there, and these people were moving, these Taliban fighters were moving with absolute impunity. So after going down to this village, we recognized that there was a little girl there who had a pretty significant deformity. And we saw her walking in the village and started talked to her and figured out that her father, after we spoke to him for a little while, was the local village doctor. So after talking to her father, we treated this little girl and started getting her some help. And the condition she had, if it had gone untreated, probably would have killed her within about a year or two. It was basically a tumor that was spreading up the side of her body. But this doctor, being the only doctor in that village, he was the person who was treating anyone who had a medical condition. And that included many of these Taliban fighters who would be wounded down in southern Afghanistan. He would see all of them as they came through. So this made him a person of, you know, pretty significant value. But now he was in a position where he needed something from us, which was medicine for his daughter. And as an intelligence officer, I was the one who was basically brokering that deal. And so day after day, I would sit down, and this man would come up to our fire base, and the two of us would talk. And he would give us information about when the Taliban was coming back and forth. And I would basically give him some money and medicine for his daughter. But he did not want to be talking with us. It was very, very obvious. And I was at a time in my life where I had actually just had my daughter. And she was about 6 months old. So here we were, two fathers sitting on a battlefield. And I could tell that this man would have done anything he could not to be sitting in the chair next to me. And I, on a very deep visceral level, did not want to put him in that situation. But I also knew we were putting him in this situation to basically save the lives of the Marines who were fighting down in southern Helmand province. And to this day, I don't proclaim to know what the relative rightness or wrongness was of either of our positions. But that moral relativity was something I wanted to explore in writing and that I wanted to show. And if the book succeeds in any way, it will show it truly enough to the reader that they can make their own determination about who is right and who is wrong. So with that, I'd like to read just one final section which conveys a little bit of what that part of the country felt like. And these are Aziz's observations as he comes down to this remote village called Gomal when he is just starting to stay with his fellow Mumtaz, whose story you heard before. The night was cold, and all through it I got up, stepped lightly over Mumtaz, and fed dried branches into the mouth of the stove. Once the last scrap burned out in the fire, a chill set into my legs and woke me. I walked into the compound's dirt courtyard to wait for the dawn. As the early light came, I saw how poor Mumtaz was. His home was nothing more than the small coop, the mud room we slept in, and the four walls of the courtyard. A ditch ran beneath one of the walls and out the back. Dishes were stacked alongside it. This was the kitchen. Past Mumtaz's compound were the mountains. Though it seemed these never ended, they were not enough to protect the village from the war. But they were enough to preserve it and its traditions. And, even as isolated as the village was, sprouts of progress had arrived. Motorbikes, cell phones, and a few homemade satellite dishes that perched from rooftops, all standing as messengers from other, more modern worlds. But it was a false progress. It measured not movement forward, but the distance we would soon travel backward when the war destroyed everything. Thank you. Ben?
All right, Elliot, congratulations on a beautiful book,
Thank you.
True book, a genuine book, and congratulations on a great launch.
Thank you.
Driving down here, Elliot told me that Green on Blue made this week's bestseller list in Washington, D.C. So nothing would make us happier if we could do the same for him here in Dallas. So yeah, a plug from the Shameless Commerce Division.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben.
So feel free to buy 4, 5, 6 copies outside. Christmas is not that far away.
I'll sign as many as you buy.
So I'm going to start you off with an easy question because this is kind of a homecoming for you. If George W. Bush was sitting here right now, what would you say to him?
Thanks, Ben. I guess I would say, are you surprised that you have so much in common with Barack Obama? What I mean by that is I think that, I think that as much as all the differences made between the two of them, particularly as it pertains to our foreign policy, there haven't been there have been some significant departures, but there's a lot more similarity than I think people would have intuited in 2008. Particularly in 2009 after the Cairo speech, there was sort of this sense that President Obama was making a very large overture to the Arab world. And I think if we look at the events from 2009 to 2015, it's been just as violent, just as contentious, really as the years before it during the Bush years. And obviously much of that has nothing to do with Obama, it just has to do with world events. But I think there are far more similarities with regards to foreign policy amongst these presidents than differences. So that's why I guess I would say, I bet you're surprised you had so much in common with Barack Obama.
Okay. One of the strongest aspects of this book is Aziz's voice. And the book is told in the first person. But the voice strikes me as absolutely authentic and genuine. And there's this almost meditative aspect to it. It's a spare voice, but it's very wise and perceptive and very modulated. And so my question to you is, where did the sound of that voice come from? I'm sure you knew many much more demonstrative Afghans. And did that voice come to you pretty quickly and intuitively, or did you have to work your way into it?
Sure. So as an advisor, I spent a lot of time speaking with Afghans, and really too in special operations as an intelligence officer. So much of my day-to-day was dealing with what they called walk-ins, which would be an Afghan who would walk onto our base with some type of information that may or may not be absolutely critical. And they usually seem to walk in like when I was either eating my pancakes or in the shower, the most inconvenient times. So that type of the rhythm of the voice, it's almost like you're walking around. When you walk around with your headphones and you're listening to a track over and over again. I was listening to that track for years, and it just kind of got ingrained in me. And so when I was thinking about the construct of the book, initially I wanted it to sort of have this cadence where it was like one of these debriefings I've become very familiar with. And in early chapters in early versions of the novel, it was told in 16 chapters. Each chapter opened up with Aziz telling his story to an American, basically an American case officer. And the rhythm of that, to me, was what I had seen in Afghanistan, but it was also sort of like this kind of Conradian, the Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe is telling his story on the boat in the Thames about going up the river. And I built that in, and I felt very comfortable with it because, I'm not telling Aziz's voice. Aziz is telling his voice to an American, so I sort of have that disclaimer on the narrative. But after going through revisions after revisions, this frame just sort of wasn't holding up, and I sort of knew it wasn't holding up, and that the American he was telling the story to seemed two-dimensional. If I wanted to blow him out, then the story started to become about this American, and that wasn't the point. So I had to ask myself some hard questions. Why did I put this American in there? Why do I feel afraid to let Aziz speak directly to the reader? And so what I wound up doing was yanking that entire frame out and then allowing Aziz to address the reader directly. And that was a relatively frightening decision to make. I mean, there's a realization that the only way this book is going to really work is if you do that. But if it doesn't really work, you're going to be, guilty of some type of horrible pantomime, which was the exact opposite intention of the novel. Right. So that was sort of how I arrived at the voice.
Okay. There's a classic book called The Art of War, written 300 or 400 years ago by Sun Tzu, and a lot of us who are in corporate America have had to read that book.
Those of us in the military, too.
Yeah.
I'm having my kids read it right now.
Yeah, those of us who've had aggressive, overbearing bosses made us read it. But one of Sun Tzu's main precepts is know your enemy. Do you think we knew our enemy when we invaded Afghanistan and then Iraq all those years ago? And second part of the question is, do you think we know our enemy now?
Well, I certainly don't think we knew our enemy when we invaded all those years ago. Not even close. But then again, I mean, can you know your enemy when a war is that quick right out the gate? I mean, I don't know if you can truly get inside them. I mean, so I don't know. I'm not interested so much in parsing out the wrongness of those decisions back then with regards to how we knew our enemy. I mean, particularly after 9/11 going into Afghanistan. I remember what it felt like to be in this country then. And to me, it seemed pretty obvious that something was going to happen there, and it sort of had to. Do we know our enemy now? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it depends on what level. One of the reasons, and I've talked to you about this before, Ben, that I became very interested in writing this book, and I've sort of shocked, I've been surprised by my interest. I have this very deep interest with my enemy, in that I have been, in many respects, defined by this experience, which was going to war as a young man. And I have a friend who was a longtime special operations officer. He's still in that line of work, and the way that we usually keep up with one another is we go for runs early in the morning, although we do very little of it now, life being what it is. And on one of our runs, we were, pounding up this hill, and we'd sort of got into this philosophical discussion about what the last 10 years had meant to us. And he looked over at me, and he said, "You know what, Elliot? The melancholy of it all is that we grew up there." And I've often thought about that, that we grew up there. And what that means to me is these experiences defined us completely. And it's sort of like you have the lost generation. I like to say we're sort of like the lost part of a generation, or the ones who went and fought these wars. And, but there's another side to that coin, and those are the people you fought against. And I know sitting out there somewhere in southern Waziristan, or in the northwest frontier province, or out in Deir ez-Zor in Syria, or in Al-Anbar, there are Iraqis, Syrians, Afghans, Pakistanis who are the people who fought against us. And they were defined in much the same way, and so defined, I have more in common with them in many respects than I do with some people at home. And and I've shared with you, I've done some journalism. I did one piece of journalism where I went and had lunch with a former member of Al Qaeda in Iraq and southern Turkey, which was pretty interesting. The two of us spent 6 hours talking about our war, two veterans of Iraq, but we'd fought on different sides, and that was strangely cathartic.
What would you suggest that our policymakers do in order to try to get to understand our enemy? What can they do to do their job better?
I think I don't know if this is directly to our policymakers, but I do think that there is a reductive narrative that goes into the way we are talking about the wars in the Middle East. Particularly the kerfluffle of about a week ago about whether or not certain policymakers or members of the media would classify ISIS as terrorists. Well, are they terrorists or are they not terrorists? You have to decide. I mean, it's reductive. Who cares? Who cares what you call them? Just because you say that they're a terrorist, well, if you don't say they're a terrorist, it doesn't mean you're endorsing them. But that was sort of what the debate had devolved into. I mean, it's like, the Nazis weren't terrorists. They were really bad guys. I mean, why are we pigeonholing everything into that? So I think that oftentimes, even at the highest levels, there isn't a really nuanced debate about who these people are, and there isn't necessarily a real effort to get into their skin to understand why somebody would join a group like ISIS or fight for Al Qaeda in Iraq. And if you can't understand why these people are making those decisions, and if you don't really make the effort to understand it, you're never going to be able to formulate a cohesive counter strategy. So, the first step in creating that strategy, I think, is some empathy and some understanding. And I think people might be afraid to do that sometimes because they feel that with that empathy and with that type of understanding is some type of maybe tacit approval for what's going on.
By the end of the book, and I'm going to try not to spoil the book, but I will say that Aziz commits a fairly significant act of aggression against an American soldier, the green on blue of the title. And so my question to you, Elliot, is does that make him an enemy of the United States?
Well, I guess we're just, I'm worried I'm going to spoil the end of the book now, too, in my response. Hence my kind of staring at the sky. But, green on blue becomes a metaphor in the book. What happens when the cause that you are fighting for threatens to destroy you? And so there is a green on blue committed in this. And I, in writing this novel and reflecting on that experience, sort of started wondering to myself, so many of the people who come back to kill us, the Taliban, as we know, the Taliban were financed by the CIA in the 1980s to fight against the Russians, which led into offshoots which led into the Taliban, which led into Al Qaeda in Iraq. If we look at what's happening in Iraq right now, you have ISIS rolling around in up-armored Humvees, which we left behind for the Iraqi army. These wars are cyclical. There are economies behind these wars. So I start speculating, in these wars, is there any way to die that's not a green on blue? It's all a green on blue, to some degree. So does that make him an enemy of the United States? I don't know. I hope you'll read the book and you all can decide. And again, my ambition in this book is not to be dogmatic and tell anybody anything. I think we have plenty of people who are doing that, but is to show something as truly as I could. And if I can show it and people can make their own determination, maybe a little bit of a bridge has been built, and I hope there's some value in that.
Yeah, I think the best novels, and Green on Blue is in that category, they raise more questions than they answer. And they give you the complexity of the experience with all its confusion and ambiguity and open-endedness. And I think that's one of the strengths of your book. It doesn't give us any easy answers, and I think that's authentic to the experience. There are no easy answers at this point. Let's talk about Mumtaz a little bit. He's an interesting character. He's the one male character in the book who's opted out of war. Mm-hmm. He has turned away from the war. He's turned away from Pashtunwali. Where did he come from, and what's he doing there?
Sure. Well, and I should, Pashtunwali is this idea. It directly translates as the way of the Pashtuns. So the Pashtus are the Aziz is ethnically Pashtu, and in Pashtunwali there's several tenets. So there is Badal, which directly translates as revenge. There's Nang, which translates as personal honor. There's a tenet called Milmastia, which translates as hospitality or sanctuary. Like, for instance, if any of you are familiar with the Marcus Luttrell lone survivor story, the reason he was protected was because of Pashtunwali Milmastia. So for the character Mumtaz, he's someone who he still adheres to many of these ideas of Pashtunwali, but in the segment I read with Mumtaz, you hear about how his brother was basically killed. And his brother was killed basically when somebody who ran a trucking company that was a competitor to his father's trucking company gave him and his brother some bad information to launch an attack, knowing that would take down the opposing trucking company. And so in telling that story in the book, I wanted Mumtaz's story to be, I wanted him to be a character who had seen sort of the cyclical nature of these wars and then had made the opposite decision, which is to get out of it. But his story was very, very common. Frequently, people make the opposite decision, and the world spirals on. For instance, historically in Afghanistan, if you are familiar with the film Restrepo by Sebastian Junger, which deals with the Korangal Valley, which is one of the most deadly stretches of land in Afghanistan. The fighting in the Korangal was fierce for 4 years. I served in the Korangal for a little while. It was a rugged and bad place. The way the fighting there started, it was a lumber dispute. The whole thing started through a lumber dispute, where basically the guy named Mullah Mateen convinced the Americans that valley that one of his competitors was working with the Taliban. So the Americans launched a raid on that competitor, knocked him out. Mullah Mateen consolidated his lumber empire, and that led to some very, very deep grievances against both the Americans and against Mateen, and that cycled into 5+ years of violence. But these are very real forces, and in the book, and with Mumtaz, one of the things I try to get in the novel is this idea that wars have economies. And I don't necessarily mean exclusively financial economies, but it's like Isak, who I used to work with. He was the senior man of a militia unit. That put him in a very important position in his society. He employed many of his extended family in that militia unit. He had no incentive to end the war. That was a very strong economy for him. So I think an examination of these incentive structures and of these economies, just through looking at them, it will give us the answers to why we've been at war for 14 years, why the Afghans have been at war for 30 years. And it might not provide us a solution for how to get out of it, but the first step of maybe understanding how to break that cycle of violence is to understand the true nature of it. And oftentimes, I don't think that true nature is appropriately conveyed. But Mumtaz sees it in the book, and Mumtaz is the one character who decides to break out of it. But his reward for breaking out of it is he lives in a one-room mud hut by himself. Mm-hmm. He's not living a great life. But
he's very isolated.
Yeah, he's very isolated.
At the end of the book. Let me ask you this, as a war novel, a literary war novel, and by literary I don't mean English professors in ascots standing around the hallway saying things like "au contraire," but by literary I mean writing that gets into the real stuff of life. the mud and guts and dirt and sex and pain and pleasure of it. So is a literary war novel, by definition, a political novel?
I think in some ways all novels are political novels. You're taking emotion and the human experience and you're pushing it out there to the fullest, and you're making some type of statement just by, I think, showing certain things. The thing that I get worried about saying that war novels are political novels is I think frequently in literature we have this tendency to categorize and reduce everything into very neat little segments. We have our fiction, we have our nonfiction, we have our poetry, and there's very little distinction between them. And then in fiction, we have our war novels in one corner, and I don't think it's doing anybody any favors to look at literature like that. I think there's a huge blurring between fiction and nonfiction that we don't even recognize. The autobiographical novel or the highly literary memoir. But specifically to your question, yeah, I think all writing is sort of political. You're standing up on a podium and you're saying something, and to me, that's politics.
Okay, I guess I'm thinking more of the substance of the book and the substance of the intrigue and what the characters are doing, and just to explain a little bit. In war novels, there is what happens on the field of battle, between these two opposing sides, and inevitably, terrible things happen, and people do lethal things to one another. And so there's that aspect of the narrative, but then a half second later, you have to ask yourself, why? To me, it's just a video game if you're just portraying the blood and guts and conflict of it. I think a natural part of the story is why.
Right, but you're also, you're mapping out the interior of what's going on. The interior of the characters as they're having these experiences. Stendhal has this great quote in The Red and the Black, which is, politics is like a weight around the neck of good literature. And I think the second you start interjecting too much, and by politics I mean, the real immediate factoids of a situation, you're basically stamping your work with an expiration date that's going to make it irrelevant. And in writing this book, I was very cognizant I wasn't trying to show the political situation in Afghanistan as it stood in 2009. There's, the dates in here are a little bit blurry, and they're blurry for a reason. My ambition was really to show a paradigm that I just kept seeing over and over again. And if I could distill that paradigm into its purest form, that's what I wanted to put into the book. So the paradigm, the paradigm is political, but I think, again, we have to get to our definition of political, but it's not political in terms of, this guy was with, Aziz was with the Taliban, or he was with Hezbollah Islam. Those were cans of worms I didn't want to open up because they would just become distractions to the reader. Right. And there are other books that do that. I wanted to try to distill, the truest thing I could about the war out of it.
Now for the big question. Where does it end? And by it, I mean these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and now in Syria and the rise of the Islamic State. Where does it end?
So there's a part, again, we seem to be focusing on the Mumtaz character a lot, but there is a part in the book where this character Mumtaz looks back and he basically says, the end is in the remembering. And what he's referring to in that case is one of the things I saw in Afghanistan frequently was, this idea that the last time there was peace in Afghanistan was 1979. And so lifespan in Afghanistan is relatively short, it's mid-60s for most people. So the people in Afghanistan right now who were adults and could remember peace were, let's say, 20 years old in 1979. They're in their 50s now, so they've got about 15 more years. So if Afghanistan doesn't find peace in about 15 more years, most of the people who were alive and can remember what the country was like when it was at peace will all be dead. And that means everyone who lives in Afghanistan will not be able to remember anything except for war. And so how do you get to peace when war becomes completely an act of reckless imagination? You have to invent it out of, or where peace becomes something you have to invent out of thin air. And that's a very real concern for Afghans. But we've been at war for 15 years. How much longer is this going to go on for? And, there's conversation about putting boots on the ground, in Syria or in Iraq. I don't know if that will happen. I tend to doubt that it will. But regardless, we've been on this war footing for a long, long time. And there's reasons behind that. We structure these wars with an all-volunteer military. They've been funded largely through deficit spending, so the new taxes. So, so we don't really feel them the way we felt other wars. But I don't know. I sometimes wonder, if my son or daughter come to me and say, I'm thinking about joining the Marines, are they going to be, going off to fight sort of the surrogates of the people that I was encountering in Fallujah and Afghanistan? I really hope not. It's a depressing thought for me.
What would you say to them if they came to you and said, Dad, I'm thinking about joining the Marines?
God, you're just not pulling your punches, are you, Ben?
Well, I want to make it interesting.
No, I'm kidding. I'd ask them why. I'd ask them why they wanted to. I would probably tell them, it's knowledge at a cost. I think, you definitely, there's experiences that I've had when I was a Marine and later on that I think showed me the extremes of the human condition and what people can undertake. But, at the same time, it's knowledge at a cost. I'm 34 years old. I got a lot of dead friends. I feel very sad about that. That's something that I will carry with me. And it's not something I necessarily want my kids to have to carry around with them. So, my hope for them would be that, if they came and they wanted to join the Marines, I hope that they would join the Marines, and it would be 4 of the most boring years that they ever had, and and we could chalk that up to a nice life experience. But unfortunately, present events in the world seem as though it might be otherwise. But that's at the end of the day, that's their decision.
All right. Let's open it up for questions. Out here, there's a gentleman back there with his hand up. We've got folks with microphones. Okay.
Elliot, during your time as advisor to Afghan combat units, did you ever have any apprehension for your own personal safety? And if you did, what measures did you take to secure yourself?
Sure. Did I ever have any... I had plenty of apprehension for my own personal safety, but I believe you mean amongst the Afghans who I was advising. The biggest thing is, these are people. I've formed very close relationships with many of the Afghans, and I felt a lot of security in those relationships. One thing with all advisors that was sort of a tell was, some guys would carry a concealed pistol on their back and some wouldn't. And that was sort of a decision that you had to make pretty early on, and you better believe the Afghans knew which advisors carried pistols and which ones didn't. So I think at a certain point I just built up a little bit of a fatalistic streak in that I knew these guys, I felt okay with them, but at the end of the day too is, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And I can't worry about this. If I'm worrying about this, I'm diverting energy from things I can actually affect, like doing my job.
Did you carry a pistol?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Sorry, that was another...
That's all right.
First of all, thank you for your service, and most appreciated. Secondly, the question I'm thinking about is the language. Was it a barrier? Did you know the local language, or did they know English, and how did you deal with that?
Sure, the language. Well, there they speak either Dari or Pashto. I actually spoke. I spoke some Dari, which was helpful. When I first became an advisor, and I was learning a little bit of Dari, one of the things I had rehearsed was introducing myself to the Afghan colonel who would become my counterpart. And I knew who he was. I was going to meet him for the first time, and so I introduced myself, and it was Isme man Toran Kahraman az didin shema khosh khodam, which means my name is Toran, Captain Ackerman. Seeing you gives me great joy. And so I'd rehearse this over and over and over again in my head, and I finally go to meet him, and he's this very tall for an Afghan, 6 foot tall colonel named Colonel Jabbar, who had fought the Soviets. They've all fought the Soviets. And he's very proud to tell me that. I said, Colonel Jabbar, isme man Toran Kahraman, az didin shema khush khodam. He said, Toran Kahraman? I said, Toran Ackerman? Toran Kahraman. I said, Toran Kahraman, yes. He said, oh, Toran Kahraman, Bisiar Khubas. That means this is the best. And I said, what is he talking about? He said, Toran Kahraman, Kahraman. Kahraman means brave guy. It's like you are a hero. I said, yes, I am Toran Kahraman. And so for that 8-month deployment, I was Captain Brave Guy. Which, apropos to the prior question, definitely helped. But the language barrier was definitely, it was there and it was real. I spoke kind of passable Dari for interaction with the soldiers. More complex meetings, I would have an interpreter. And we became very close with our interpreters. The novel is dedicated to Ali and Big Cheese, who were my friends. And Ali and Big Cheese were 2 soldiers who had come to speak English so well, they also doubled as interpreters, and I became very close with them. But also in writing the book, language was something that was always on my mind. The novel is in Pashto. And what I mean by that is, it's obviously in English, but it's all these Afghans, they're all speaking together, and there's only one American character. So in writing the book, I had to figure out, how is the language going to be handled? And so when the American comes into the book, the Afghan, he is actually an American who is speaking Pashto, and his language is very clipped, and the Afghans remark to one another, that Mr. Jack, he speaks like a child. So the book is in Pashto, but yes, it was something we were always thinking about.
I'm going to be enlisting come May. There's a lot of work ethic that you have to put in. So when I see a Marine, I see somebody who never gives up. What's the work ethic you would have, say, something basic as come the Reaper at the end of the Crucible? What had you kept going, especially in war? And then what was your opinion of the reawakening that Commandant Amos had?
Well, I think that's one of the great things that the Marines does is, you're imbued with a certain type of work ethic. Particularly with the writing, it's something that you just, grind out. So I'm a grinder. When I'm working on something, I try to do 1,000 words every day, and that takes me most of the day. But if I ever miss a day, I'm so filled with self-loathing, you don't want to be around me. So I guess that, people get self-loathing from all sorts of places. I can thank the U.S. Marine Corps for that, as it relates to my work ethic. I'm not familiar with General Amos's reawakening policies. Sort of once I got out of the Marine Corps, I guess I kind of stopped paying attention to the detailed sort of internal policies within the organization. And one of the great things the Marine Corps does is, we like to say the last thing they do is when you get out, they give you a mild lobotomy, so you forget all of the bad times and you can only remember the good times. So I look back at my time. I do seriously look back at my time in the Corps, with a lot of fondness. So, get after it. I hope you have a good time down in Parris Island.
I sometimes, I frequently feel that our population is very disconnected to what's really going on over there. Even though we hear about it every day, it's really not connected to us. I'd be interested in your opinion on that. And if you're over there and fighting, do you feel that we here are not so connected with what you're doing? And also, is there a segment of the population in Iraq or Afghanistan that might be like us?
I'll maybe take the last part of that question first. I, having traveled the world, believe that we as humans have much, much more in common with one another than we have different. The Afghans and the Iraqis I met, they're just like us. They care about the things we care about. They care about sending their kids to a good school. They care that their kids will have a better life than they did. They want safety. They want clean drinking water. I mean, they want the basic things that everybody wants. And I think, oftentimes, the cultural barriers between us, which ultimately I find are somewhat superficial, get in the way of that. This same Colonel Jabbar, I remember one time we had to fly around Afghanistan because we were relocating his battalion across the country. And so he had to move his 700 men from the east of the country all the way to the west towards the Iranian border. And there were a lot of meetings to do this. And it was a time in Afghanistan, the commando unit he was a part of was something very new. And so a lot of the Americans weren't used to seeing an Afghan flying on American transport. But I was sort of his interlocutor, so I was getting him on helicopters to go from this base to that base. And some of the Americans didn't want to let him on. They weren't sure that was, according to regulations, they hadn't seen it before. Which was, for me, frankly, it was a little frustrating. I'm like, hey, this guy's you're in his country. He should be able to fly around here. But what it also led to, you talk about the similarity between peoples, is a lot of really long, awkward layovers in airports with just me and Colonel Jabbar. Just the two of us, and he didn't speak great English, and I didn't speak great Dari at the time. So what do? So what do? We started playing chess, and it led to this week-long epic chess battle where he just completely eviscerated me over a week. And it was right at the beginning of our relationship. And he used to sit there, and we would play, not really talking with one another, we would just be playing, but the one thing he would always say to me in English was after he would knock over my king with usually his pawn, he would kind of chuckle himself and go, ha, ha, ha. My advisor. But if we hadn't figured out how to play chess with one another, it would have seemed as though there was this huge gulf between the two of us. And he was exactly the same as me, just much better at chess. With regards to coming home, we touched on this before. These wars, every war has a structure. It's set up in a certain way. The Second World War was set up with a national mobilization. People bought bonds. The Vietnam War was characterized by a pretty large-scale draft. These wars have been characterized by an all-volunteer military, and they've been financed through deficits, largely by deficit spending, and no one's paying much more in their taxes because we're at war. And one of the byproducts of that is that, there's a pretty significant civil-military divide right now. Where the people who've been in the military have been sort of fighting World War II for the last 15 years, and nobody else has. And listen, I don't know if that's right or wrong. I remember when I first came back, and this issue would come up, and people would say, I wish we felt this more. There's this part of me that's always like, I'm kind of glad you don't. That's why I'm over there, so everybody at home doesn't have to feel this. But then, we also, as a nation, I was a Marine, so I didn't wear an American flag on my shoulder, but the soldiers who would wear American flags on their shoulders, that's what people see overseas. So I think it's very dangerous if the way we project force overseas isn't something that's in the center of our cultural narrative, as an American people. And I feel like right now it's not, because people aren't feeling it, and we should pause and reflect on what that means.
The concept of you working against your own interests, which must set up terrible psychological problems for the people who are feeling it. You talked about the Afghans who were feeling it. Do you think Americans who are fighting over there sometimes feel that too? And could that be a contributor to the terrific amount of PTSD we see in soldiers coming home?
Sure. I've spent a lot of time thinking about PTSD. I would commend to you a book by a guy named David J. Morris. He wrote a book called The Evil Hours. Just came out last month. It's an excellent book on PTSD. He sort of does it like The Emperor of Maladies, where it's a biography of PTSD. And I will tell you, I did a panel with him. He's a great guy. But when I got the book, almost 400-page tome on PTSD, I definitely did not feel like reading that. And it's an amazing read. It's really great. But thinking about this question, there are the people who have PTSD, and they have the full-on, they have nightmares, they have flashbacks. It's a very real thing. But then there's sort of everybody else. And, when you're 19 or 20 years old and you go in the military and there's a war on, you are you are surrounded by your friends and you're sent to go do something very, very dangerous. So I would say, you have a heightened sense of purpose. And I think purpose is something in our lives, all of us, you have to be happy. Now, whether your purpose is, sort of a common one, which is, you work hard, you put food on the table, you're able to send your children to school, they're going to have maybe a better life than you had. That's a good sense of purpose. It gives you the satisfaction you need to be happy. Well, when you go to war, and again, you're 19, 20 years old, you're surrounded by some of your closest friends. You have, at least at the tactical level, often a mission that's relatively clear. And that's a very intense sense of purpose. Like if purpose were a drug, I would say that's like the crystal meth of purpose. Very, very hard stuff. So you begin, you're a soldier, a Marine, 19, 20 years old, you're like freebasing the crystal meth of purpose. And then you get into maybe your mid-20s, you can't do it forever. And you decide it's time to come home. And so you come home, and the first thing you need to do is repurpose yourself. What are you going to do now? And I think for a lot of servicemen, they look at what's out there afforded to them, and nothing comes close to combat, to being there with your best friends. And so if that was the crystal meth of purpose, like what they're viewing now is like the Coors Light of purpose. And I think that there is an associated depression that comes with its realization that the rest of my life I'm going to be sitting on my front porch just drinking Coors Light, and that's it for me. And I think a lot of it kind of comes in that spirit, is the contrast between those two.
You mentioned The Heart of Darkness earlier, and I wondered what other books, either fiction or nonfiction, you were thinking about or were useful to you as you were writing.
Oh, geez. Well, I'm a big fan of Conrad. I love Graham Greene. Two books that really meant a lot to me are André Malraux's Man's Fate, which is about he's a French writer, and it's about the failed communist uprising in China. And then Styron's The Confessions of Nat Turner meant a lot to me. Him writing in the voice of the leader of a slave revolt in the 19th century. So those are a couple of the books that were my touchstones as I went along.
This is a journalistic question. Do you, from where you sit now in Turkey and as a journalist, do you think that the Middle Eastern countries and world can summon the will to defeat ISIS on their own?
Sure. I'll answer your question with the preface that I actually don't consider myself a journalist. I consider myself a dilettante novelist who sometimes plays around in journalism, writes essays and ruminations. Listen, I think what's going on in the Middle East right now is they're having there's an existential question that's being posed to them. Is what is the future of Islam? Is it going to be these more progressive strains or something more fundamentalist, more Salafist? And the other side of it too is what is the future of the Sunni and Shia states, the Gulf Arabs versus the Iranians? And those are some pretty broad and sweeping questions. And ISIS obviously represents the many disenfranchised Sunnis, or Sunnis who feel they're disenfranchised, and also have a very fundamentalist view of Islam. It's not something that I think as the West, we're going to play a role, but our role is an ancillary role. These are questions that they have to answer themselves. And often if I look through history, I feel like they're kind of going through a period. Look at Europe in the 20th century. There were many of these similar questions being asked in Europe in terms of what the future of that region was going to look like. So I don't know how it all shakes out. I think it's going to take a while.
Based on your personal experiences, what would you say to the president or any political leader in Washington about a way out of the dilemma that the country faces in the Mideast?
You're tougher than Ben. I would not sit up here and and presupposed to offer in a soundbite a solution to the Middle East. And I think it's very easy to sit down at our policymakers, Republican or Democrat, and kind of throw stones at what they're doing. I mean, it's a huge challenge. This is not an easy thing to figure out what direction the Middle East is going to go. And frankly, it's one where I don't think we are not the ones who are going to deliver the answer, as much as it is frequently in our American spirit to believe that we will be the solution to everybody's ills. Again, to the other gentleman's question, the answers to these issues are not ones that Americans have. They're ones that Saudis, Iraqis, Iranians, Syrians are going to have to find for themselves. And I think for us, I would proceed along a course that keeps U.S. national interests first and foremost in our mind, and sort of with the idea of first do no harm, because I think that is a conflict we don't necessarily want to rush into hastily and get entangled in.
So I think we'll stop here. Again, I want to put in a plug for the Dallas bestseller list for Elliot. Let's put him over. He'll be signing books outside. And I want to say, Elliot, thank you very much for coming to Dallas.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.